Most of the music, in fact we may say all of the music that survives from the Middle Ages, survives in manuscript form. Yet another important source for reconstructing our musical past are fragments of manuscripts, from entire leaves to really tiny strips of parchment, surviving from what once were complete volumes. The use of such fragments was almost always as scrap material, some kind of medieval recycling, we might say. Magdalen College is one of the few small research libraries in Oxford to possess some very fine examples of medieval music manuscript fragments. One of the pieces in the college collections is a fragment of a processional, the book that contained all the chants and directions for the performance of processions. Processions had a primary function of enriching the liturgy of a particular festivity or a particular important saint's day, possibly a volume rather small in format, which could have been carried in a procession. Most people would know that the day after Christmas Day is the feast of Saint Stephen, the first martyr of Christianity, who was stoned to death in the 1st century AD.
It's really very special to have this wonderful choir of clerks and boys that have been singing in this chapel as a foundation for over 500 years. And we've tried to reenact a procession that would have taken place during a service of Vespers, which is an evening service. Vesper just means evening, in Salisbury Cathedral. Music would have been sung by poor clerks, as they were known, or clerks in minor holy orders. So not very dissimilar from the academical clerks that we have in Magdalen College choir.
The fragment very clearly tells us the number of deacons and of clerics that should have been involved in the procession, how the deacons should dress, and that they should carry candles.
So what we've done here in Magdalen is to have the clerks and choir processing from the antechapel through into the main inner chapel here, and then forwards to an altar with candles where the service of Vespers would have continued. A dark chapel full of candles, the deacons at the front of the procession holding candles. So we have this wonderful sense of light.
We have to sort of peel back the layers and go back to this much earlier style and try and find a way of performing, especially the plain song, which is very, very simple, but which was completely governed by the text. And it's trying to find that text-based approach to music that is one of the joys of working with earlier music.
One gets a real sense of what it would have been like in that time.
Looking at these manuscripts and singing from them brings this music to life in a very special way, because we feel that we're engaging with the music of the past in a unique and very real way.
The single melodies of plainchant certainly constituted an essential part of the musical experience of medieval liturgy. Yet a parallel, in fact complementary, style of singing existed in England. A style that required two or more voices singing different melodies at the same time, that is, polyphony. Relatively little remains of such repertory from the central Middle Ages, and what survives consists almost entirely of fragments. The most famous group of fragments is arguably the one believed to have been produced at Worcester Cathedral between the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 14th century. 6 fragments were used as end leaves in the binding of this beautiful early 13th century Worcester Psalter. The ghost of these fragments is still visible through the traces left by almost 5 centuries inside the binding. One of the fragments that used to be part of the binding of the Magdalen Psalter contains the motet Salve Mater Redemptoris. Here, a complex 4-voice polyphony is perceived as even more intricate by the presence of a different text in each of the 4 voices.
We've come to have a very different idea about what singing in the chapel means to the ideas that perhaps our predecessors in the 15th century would have had. And so it can be quite challenging for the choristers and the clerks to look at this older music and try and think back to how it might have sounded in those days.
One of the fragments in the college collections preserved a more practical, less elaborate style of polyphonic singing that enriched the liturgy of the more common feasts. Like this 3-voice setting of the Gloria and excelsis Deo, written in England towards the middle of the 14th century. As you can see, the text begins with Pax hominibus bone voluntatis, since the incipit Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra had to be intoned by the priest in plainchant.
Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax hominibus bone voluntatis laudamus Deo.
When this building was designed and conceptualized and built in the late medieval period, this would have been a Catholic chapel, of course, and plainchant would have been at the heart of the polyphony and worship sung here.
Magdalen College was founded in 1458 by William of Waynflete, 2 years after he became Lord Chancellor to King Henry VI. And one of the most important aspects was, of course, the statutory requirement for clerks and choristers, a tradition that continues to this very day.
The title Informator Choristarum means director of the choir, teacher of the choristers, and the title goes back to the 15th century when the college was founded and is still in use today.
This is MS Lat 248, commonly known as the Scroll Considerans. It is a genealogical tree, a genealogical history of the kings of England, dating all the way back to Adam and Eve and Caesar and Brutus, right the way through Henry VI. And when it's completely rolled out, it's over 12 meters long, 42 feet long. And that makes it one of the largest medieval scrolls of that time period. It concludes at Henry VI, so this is clearly being produced sometime in the 1450s. Mm-hmm. Here at Henry VI, you can see the crown, the golden decoration around his name, and then a passage about his reign and what he did during his reign.
It is possible that it was for the Chapel Royal of King Henry VI himself that a manuscript of sacred polyphonic music was written a few years earlier, around 1420s, 1430s. This manuscript, sometimes referred to as the Lost Royal Choir Book, is preserved only in a handful of fragments.
They probably came from a choir book from the Royal Chapel under Henry VI. The Chapel Royal, of course, was the major institution in the country. We don't know exactly when these pieces were composed. They came from a choir book from the 3rd decade of the 15th century, very probably.
These leaves, arguably the most important sources of medieval music in the college, are of a large format, common to choir books of this period, and beautifully decorated. The great penmanship of the notator in particular is truly remarkable.
It shows all the intricacies of musical notation as it was practiced in the early 15th century. So it means that the color of the ink changes fairly frequently between black and red. These changes change, well, the meter of the music in a way. Melodically, there's a very sonorous quality. It is beyond a shadow of doubt, however, that this was music written by professionals for other professionals.
Fragments are especially fascinating in that they often crop up in relatively unusual places and sometimes totally unexpected. But I think what is really exciting about fragments more than manuscripts is exactly their incompleteness, their status as scatterings, almost as ruins of a rich and complex musical past. In them, and each of them in a different, highly individual way, we can appreciate more clearly the passage of time. We can imagine the social and cultural context in which they originated, but we can also see their later life as binding material, and finally as objects of study. Fragments that were once considered as waste endured through centuries of neglect and are now among the most important sources to preserve the very music that we can now hear and enjoy some 700 years later.